There's a lot of dialogue currently about patriarchy and misogyny and different systems of oppression. And when we're having conversations about patriarchy and misogyny, it very rarely goes over, crosses into sex, intimacy, and our personal relationships. And these are things that I'm very passionate about that has actually been a through line for me, starting with relationship coaching, doing conflict resolution for organizations, and then doing the work that I'm doing out here for liberation and social justice. So, how do these things all connect? And what do we do with that? Hello, and welcome to Conversations for the People with Matthew Solomon. I'm Matthew Solomon, and I'm very excited to have Dr. Kate Balestrieri on the show. Dr. Kate and I, we've known each other for several years online. We've met in person. She is a licensed psychologist in both clinical and forensic psychology, which is fascinating. She is the founder of Modern Intimacy, and she's the host of Get Naked with Dr. Kate. And I'm going to let her explain all of that. And we're going to talk about relationships. We're going to talk about what's being discussed as the epidemic of male loneliness and the things that we can all do to have better, happier, more fulfilling, and enlivened lives. So please welcome to the show, Dr. Kate Balestrieri. Thank you so much for being here on Conversations for the People.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's been just for the folks who are watching and listening. We've been following each other. I started following you on Instagram, I think 5 years ago or something. I know I've referred some people to you as
Thank you.
well, and really appreciate the work that you do. And we had the opportunity to meet in person a couple months ago, which was awesome. And one of the things that I really love about your work is that you're not only doing like mental health and therapy and sex and intimacy, which are all things that are very important to me, but you also intersect that with social justice, racial justice, and things like that, which are also really important to me. And it's unfortunately been rare in our field to see people who are addressing all of those things.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. And I would love to, I mean, I guess we can just jump into, well, first of all, how do you describe what you do? Because there's a lot of different elements, and then there's the forensic
Yeah,
part, which I was like, what exactly does that mean in terms of therapy? So
sure. Yeah. So I am a licensed psychologist and I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist. I'm also a certified sex therapist, the PACT trained couples therapist, and a certified sex addiction therapist. So I would say the through line for my career has been understanding people's relationships with sex and the implications around mental health and their relationships. And these three domains often overlap a lot. Our mental health, our relationships, our sex lives are quite intertwined. So I've worked with folks in every domain of life, including incarcerated sex offenders. And then I now own a private practice across the country with providers in, I think, about 13 states. Um, and we really help folks heal from sexual trauma, address things like infidelity, sexual dysfunction, pain during penetration, compulsive or problematic sexual behavior, a wide spectrum of again anything along that through line of sexuality.
yeah. And I'm curious because for me, because I started, well, in filmmaking and all that, but I was coaching couples, through the lens of like communication and intimacy and things like that as a coach. And you're licensed, so it's different.
Mhm.
And what I noticed was when I transitioned into working inside of organizations, that it was a lot of the same skills, a lot of the same tools and techniques. And so I'm curious, your perspective on that.
The difference between coaching and therapy.
Coaching and therapy, but then also the intersection of or how how we do like interpersonal relationships versus the bigger picture, in our communities and
Yeah, I think the the word that's coming to mind that maybe is a starting point for us in the conversation is integration, right? We are really relational beings, and that means different things to different people, of course, but we are defined by our relationships to other people. We are either safe or hurt or both in relationships with other people. So I see our work as therapists and as coaches as a bit of a social microcosm. We get to be in relationship in a way that is structured, boundaried, very hopefully very safe for clients, and in a way that helps them become the architect of how they want to be in relationship and how they want to be witnessed and heard and helped and seen. And then that can be something generalizable that they take into their other relationships and into the community. But in terms of incorporating social justice into the work, I think it's important to recognize the way that oppression really influences people's identity, their coping skills, their access to care, their felt sense of belonging in a world or in a country or in a community. And all of those realities have huge implications for people's well-being and their relational safety, their quality of life. So I see them as really intertwined. And as coaches and therapists, we have an opportunity to meet people in a certain element of that experience, which has ripple effects into the community. But also, as social justice focused folks, we can address sort of community, which then makes its way into the individual.
yeah, yeah. Thank you for explaining that. One of the things that so in my film Reimagining Safety, there a couple of the people in the film talk about how it's one thing to be out there organizing and uh, doing the work,
Mhm.
and but then there's also the inner work that hasn't been talked about as much. In the last year or two, it's been great to see that discussion. Like Adrienne Marie Brown
Mhm.
talks about this. There's a great book called Healing Justice Lineages that talks about um, the interpersonal work. And so I'm curious from your perspective also as a therapist, when because there's like the one-on-one therapy, but then there's the couples therapy. And so have you seen psychology become move more in the direction of understanding systemic issues or not? And I'm just curious your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think that the field of psychology has a lot of room to grow, and um, certainly in the 2 decades that I've been in this space, I've seen a lot of movement. And there already, when I joined this industry, there was already a big focus on understanding social justice issues. But I think it's important to remember that the people who become therapists are also people first, and they are conditioned by the environments and the ideologies in which they grew up. And there is a lot of opportunity to have growth and deconstruction and progress and understanding. And that growth is somewhat limited by the willingness of the people who seek it out, or who don't. So I think that there are many therapists who are incredible in this space. They understand the importance of understanding social issues and how that influences the individual and vice versa. And there are people who are really against that. They don't get it, they don't understand it, and they're pretty guarded against it, and they're still practicing. So I think what is beautiful about our field is that people can find a provider who is a good fit for them. But ultimately, I think the field is moving in a direction that understands the need for more integration um, of the two. And my hope is that more therapists will, challenge themselves in the ways that they need to be in that space where we are all works in progress.
Yeah. Yeah. And with your work, is there like a consistent through line or a consistent issue or challenge that is like, okay, if we just like fixed this one thing socially, we'd all be better off? Like, is there something like that, or is it different?
Uh,
Or
I think it's dangerous to be that reductionistic.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I think we could start with maybe a conversation about the redistribution of wealth. I think that is a really huge ecological barrier to a lot of people getting what they need to feel safe in this world. And when we are in a constant state of survival or feeling unsafe, it makes it really difficult for us to be more embodied. It makes it really difficult for us to have a growth mindset. It makes it really difficult for us to feel regulated in our nervous systems. And so that makes people far more vulnerable to exploitation and to, just never really being able to thrive in a way that they would otherwise have the potential to. So, I think that's very intentional politically.
Mm-hmm.
There are a few mental health people out there who have talked about how stoking fear as a political strategy is one way to keep a base of folks very inflamed and very desperate for power. When we feel disempowered, we want power.
Yeah,
So I think that as therapists, we have a unique opportunity to help folks really get in their bodies, practice emotion regulation. And that's not the whole answer,
yeah,
of course, but I
yeah.
think it's a start in reclaiming a sense of power over um, what can feel very disorienting, dysregulating, and very real.
Yeah,
When you look out in the world, we can't, no individual has power over these systems. So, when we can stay more regulated, we can build more community. And within community, we have more resonance and we have more belonging, and then we have more power. We have more of a voice.
yeah. And so like in interpersonal relationships, so with couples, do you see that? I mean, I can see sort of that, but how redistribution of wealth, but certainly the safety and that sort of thing
Mm.
shows up in like partnerships or romantic relationships.
Yeah, I mean the dyad is our smallest social system, right?
Mm.
So in our relationships with partners become our most prominent, if we're monogamous, um, system of two. And if we're non-monogamous, they become our most prominent system of multiple partners. But for most folks, um, our romantic relationships become our primary attachment figures in our adult lives. They also become our source of safety and connection, first and foremost, to the world. So I think romantic relationships have a unique opportunity to talk about social justice issues and to talk about how power is shared or not in
Mm.
partnership. And this is a place where we can practice equity first and foremost, practice support first and foremost. And when couples do that, they often experience a relationship that is so incredible. When they're not committed to that, we see a lot of folks showing up for couples therapy, and a lot of what they are talking about is really about power. It's about
Mm.
control. It's about authority. And those are the implicit themes that are creating disconnect in their romantic partnerships.
Yeah. Yeah, and just to go one step further, because you are a sex therapist, like
Mhm.
how does this, like, I'm trying to think of how to ask that. How does this affect sex and intimacy, and or does sex and intimacy affect um like where do those challenges come into play when you're working with couples or individuals?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, a big part of what I've been looking at throughout my career is the relationship between gender, sexuality, and power. And certainly, power dynamics play out through sex in relationships of all gender and sexual orientations. And particularly in heterosexual relationships, there's a lot of unconsciousness around the ways in which we are socialized to overcouple gender and power and sex specifically. So, what I find a lot of the time is that for partners who are struggling with sexual disconnection, there's often a power struggle going on somewhere too. They're not being explicit about how they feel. Someone doesn't feel like they can be. Maybe both partners don't feel like they can be. But there are a lot of expectations around how we communicate power through sexuality. And we're seeing that in our political systems right now, too. There's a big reason why abortion is on the ticket in so many states and why this has become such a big issue. Controlling sexuality is often about controlling gender. And when that is what's happening systemically, it often is implicitly communicated to people about how they are supposed to relate to sex and gender in their own lives and identities. So, sex becomes a vehicle for a lot of conversations about power in relationships.
Yeah. And as you were saying that, I was thinking about how in the last, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years, I've noticed on social media mostly, like there's with women in particular, like the uh liberated, like wild
Mhm.
woman owning my sexuality, my power. Um, and of course there's unfortunately the pushback on that, but that has been, something I've been very aware of. Uh,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's a great example of how
Mhm.
sexuality and power are becoming such a point of personal liberation and oppression all at the same time, right? We have all these women who biologically have tremendous sexual potential, pleasure potential in their bodies, and they want to experience it. They want to be fulfilled. And then slut shaming
Mhm.
is a tool of oppression to keep female sexuality suppressed and relegated to a function for men, for men's pleasure, for men's procreation. And so we have, again, this sort of cross section of the political and the personal that is really hard to navigate for people because, a lot of partners will say, oh, I want my partner to have so much pleasure. And then at the same time, they're engaging in political systems that require the suppression of that sexuality. So, implicitly, there's a lot of mixed message about when is sex okay, who gets to experience pleasure, why not, what are the repercussions and the consequences of sexual desire and pleasure and behavior. And a lot of these conversations are being had implicitly through lots of different behaviors and ways of shaming and controlling people.
Yeah, I also, as a cis hetero man, uh, I also have experienced personally, like, that there's fear there too,
Yeah,
right? Because we're not taught we're not really taught how to have sex. We're not taught how to be intimate. Like, we have porn.
right.
And, I'm 51. So if you're like my age, like we had to hunt for it, and it was a very specific kind. And um, so we're not really taught, we're there's this, like, we're shown ideas of what it's supposed to look like. If
Mm.
we don't measure up, literally and figuratively, there's something wrong with us. And then, okay, here's a woman who's liberated and expressive and empowered. And then for a lot of us, I think it can become very like, oh, I don't know what to do now, or I don't know how to handle this. So then we got to control it. Like yeah.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you putting that into words. I think that's a big part of, and this brings us back to the conversation about fear and dysregulation in our nervous systems. When we feel vulnerable and afraid or like we don't measure up, yeah, we often try to control that circumstance or that outcome so that we can feel more secure. That's a function of being dysregulated. And it's a way in which, again, sex becomes this weaponry of building esteem or controlling for adverse outcomes. But if we instead focused on how to celebrate vulnerability
Mm.
and acceptance and non judgment and exploration and mutuality, I think there would be a lot less vulnerability that would lead to this need to control.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love the like the non-judgment part because I think this will segue into why I originally reached out, which I was looking for a reason to have you on anyway. And one of my really dear friends, Amanda, sent me a post about the epidemic of male loneliness, and
Mm,
she was like, "Will you please talk about this? Because not only do men experience it, um, but on the flip side." Understandably, women, generally speaking, a lot of women have been exhausted with, emotional intelligence and how men are showing up or not showing up. A lot of the misogyny that gets acted out, but
mhm.
that when a man who has done a lot of work shows up, a lot of times there are women who don't know how to handle that, even though they've been wanting that. And so, yeah, go ahead.
I think a lot of women don't trust that
Mm,
initially because there are a lot of men who will take a few steps and then they stop and they say, I've done the
mm.
work. I've done the work. See, I've done the work, and now you should trust me carte blanche. And I think when we're talking about sexism, it's really important for men to recognize that sexism not only has been horrific for anyone who does not identify as a man, but it's also been horrific for men. It's corrupted men's development. It's arrested their emotional development. It has required them to cut off huge parts of themselves, huge parts of their humanity, and they spend the bulk of their emotional lives trying to compensate for that and hurting lots of people around them
Yeah.
as a result of the deficits that are required of them in order to, hold membership in this club of men. And I get it. I mean, I'm not a man, so maybe I don't get it from a lived perspective, but I've worked with thousands of men at this
Mhm.
point. So, I really understand their pain and I hear it every day how lonely they are, how much they crave connection. And the way they go about getting it often feels very duplicitous and guarded. And I get that, right? Like they're learning new skills. And when they've done a few things to do the work, quote unquote, a lot of men are deciding what is that end point for them. And
Mhm.
then women still are being asked to pick up the slack, right? So there's a bit of a disconnect, I think, for a lot of men and a lot of women um, around what is a finish line, because first of all, there isn't a finish line,
Yes.
right? But I think a lot of men sort of decide for themselves, like, here's as far as I'm willing to go. And that still requires a lot of women to pick up the slack. So when men are faced with, this question of like, women don't know what to do with us, I don't know if it's that they don't know what to do or that what you're bumping up against is still a bit of a trauma response.
Mhm. For
Women
sure.
who have been really exploited by men who claim to have done the work or claim to be safe, and they're still not really aware of the demands they're placing on women in that effort.
Yeah. And I think like even, because on my journey, I started studying Tantra or Neo Tantra, um, to do my own self work to address some of these things. And it's been amazing. And I know that a lot of these, like, quote, gurus or men who are, leaders in these organizations, there's been a lot of uh, sexual violence and things like that um, uh, women have repeatedly experienced. So yeah, the trust part, like I at this point in my life, and it's interesting because we were talking about like relationships and then social justice,
Mhm.
right? At this point in my life, even doing the film, even doing the work I've done, I know that I have to continually show up and be aware of my place as a white male
Mhm.
in all of these spaces, and that I may screw up and I get to deal with that in a way that with integrity,
Right.
should that happen.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, yeah, I have to keep proving myself. And that's okay because I get it. And I think it's the same thing, like as we're talking through, like same thing in personal relationships.
Yeah.
I get to keep proving myself, and that's okay.
Right. Not only is it okay, it's beautiful, right?
Mm.
Because that effort is what is reparative in most relationships, and it's what brings people closer together. And the majority of people that I work with, regardless of their gender, one of the biggest things they want to know is that my partner is invested in this process.
Yeah.
And what often happens is people get confronted with the mistakes that they make on the journey, which are plentiful,
Yes.
right? None of us are perfect. We all step in landmines. And it's imperative that when we do, we are open to that feedback and we can go, with humility and go, oh shit, okay. Thank you for letting me know that shouldn't be your labor to do, but I really appreciate you letting me know. And now I'm going to go reflect on that and do better. Right. And when people do that and they really match their actions with their words, it is so reparative and so trust building, and it creates um, a space where people can be imperfect and
Mm.
still have that connection that they're desperately seeking. But what ends up happening is a lot of folks get confronted with the landmines that they step in and they go, oh, that can't possibly be me, you're wrong,
Mhm.
or your demands are too much, your expectations of me are too high. And that's an intimacy impediment right there, because they're no longer willing to be influenced by the impact of their behavior on their partner. What is their partner supposed to do with that?
Yeah. Yeah, there was a couple teachers of mine in a coaching organization I was in, where they're
Mhm.
like, you can be right or you can have love. And
Yeah.
and when we get into like the right and wrong
Mm.
and no, it's your fault, no, like that, I mean, and then that just keeps getting, worse and worse and worse.
Totally. Yeah. I tell partners all the time, you're both right and you're both wrong. So let's end this conversation, because we're not even talking about the details,
Mhm.
because everyone's subjective experience is different and it will remain different, right? There isn't like a wholly objective truth to get to when you're in relationship. And the more productive strategy is to really understand each other's subjective realities and to validate that. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to say, yes, that's what happened, but you can say, oh, I see that that was your experience of that. Okay, here was my experience of that. And when you move away from trying to determine who is right, which is about power, by the way.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
You can either have power or you can be connected, and I think that's a really important point of reflection for partners that feels
Mm.
super vulnerable.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. Thank you. Um, one, so what I wanted to um get into a little bit is which we started talking about, the epidemic of loneliness among
Yeah.
men. And so the first time I heard that verbalized was Professor Scott Galloway, who had mentioned that. I was like, oh my
Mhm.
God, that's so great. Somebody's talking about this. But
Mhm.
where the conversation often stops is like, that's it. There's this epidemic of male loneliness. He talks about how on dating apps, he has said men have it worse. And I'm like, well, you haven't talked to women,
Right.
if that's what you're saying. But his thesis is men have it worse because only the top 10% best looking men are the ones who get all the attention. But then that's where his analysis seems to stop. And so there's never really a conversation that I've heard where it's like, well, what can men do about this? Because, I've worked with men. I know that there are ways that we can show up that
Mhm.
like that make us more attractive, whether it's physically or not. There's, like you were talking about, being present and being um just willing to not have to be right and not play the power game. So I'm
Mhm.
curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah. What is Professor Galloway's what are his credentials? Isn't he a professor in economics?
Yeah, I believe. Yeah. Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
Um, I appreciate a lot of what he's saying, trying to bring this issue to light. And I think one of the things that is really important to remember is that we all have our areas of expertise, And one of the dangers of speaking outside your areas of expertise is that you often perpetuate a lot of misinformation unknowingly and even with the best of intentions. So when I look around at all of the people that I work with, um, I would say there's a tremendous amount of pain and disconnection for people of all genders.
Yeah.
So this is not a problem unique to men. The loneliness epidemic with men is in large part the way that sexism and patriarchy has created for men this expectation that they are in constant competition amongst each other for power. And that power is often defined by wealth, access to sex with women, and stoicism, right? A disconnection from emotions. So a lot of men are really relationally underdeveloped, and their loneliness comes from not having strong emotional community. A lot of men bond together over sports and they do have some community, but their social and relational engagement is often pretty superficial. And even on the surface, it often looks like covert competition
Yeah.
and jarring. And so there's not a tremendous amount of vulnerability that happens for men within their own communities. I've spoken with lots and lots of men, thousands of men at this point, and one of the biggest complaints that I hear from them when they're being real is that they are really lonely for male connection. They're lonely for connection with brothers, for fathers, with uncles, with neighbors, as much as they are with women. But they're socialized to disavow all of those emotional needs, so much so that there is a term called normative male alexithymia, which essentially means that part of their gender role socialization of men is to disconnect from their feelings to the point where they have deficits in being able to name their feelings, discern between emotional states, and recognize, oh, I can feel more than one thing at the same time, or communicate their feelings. So their relationships really, really suffer, their relationships with themselves, with other men. And then they go to women looking for all of this emotional regulation, safety, nurturance, and care because they've been told over and over again that they can't access that within themselves or within other men without looking weak.
Yeah.
And so this is why there is a male loneliness epidemic, and it is real and it is serious. We have men at much higher risk of abusing substances and a much higher risk of completing suicide. Men are in trouble right now. And a big part of what is holding them back is holding on to these old, outdated ideas about masculinity that require them to be separate from their emotional integration. And until men get real about that, and until they really work together to challenge this hierarchy within masculinity and to challenge the need to be anything but what they deem feminine, they're going to be lonely. And they're not even going to be able to find that respite fully in the comfort of women. And that's not women's job, by the way.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
it's not our job to nurture men into some sort of whole human state. But that's what a lot of men expect. And so they are coming up short because they are going to relationships expecting to be patched together and held together so that they don't have to take accountability for their feelings or their loneliness. And women are saying, you know what, we can't do this for you anymore. We got to just like take care of ourselves. It's been a lot. We love you guys, but like, can you please step into this work?
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting. I was, thinking about the times that I've been invited into like men's retreats.
Mm-hmm.
And, like there in particular, there was like a father-son weekend retreat. And it's like, we're gonna do what men do, and we're gonna roll around in the mud and, scream and da 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 da. And like, and I was like, I'm not really interested in that, you know? And I have male friends where we talk and we cry and we,
Yeah.
like can connect on that level, but it's not, in quotes, the norm
Mm-hmm.
for what's available to us.
Yeah. But when I find, and I would love to hear your experience about this, given that you are someone who has been invested in this work for a long time. My experience is that when men really get it and they start leaning into more emotional integration and they prioritize all kinds of relationships and vulnerability in those relationships, they really start to have a life that feels a lot more meaningful and a lot more regulated. Um, I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean the loneliness part is definitely still there, to be honest. I mean, but also it's been, like the last 4 years have been uh a roller coaster, in society and personally. And I think I know that the more like in 2018 I was having suicidal ideations,
Mm,
and I was in a very low place, and then I started working with a therapist who I had worked with therapists and um counselors and stuff before, but this particular therapist has been amazing. And so I
good.
got really lucky, and and there are people who are very close to me that I've known since like seventh grade, like junior high school friends, who are still around, and we know each other, like we know each other. So
Hmm.
so that's really helpful. And in fact, one of them, who does a lot of uh, sex and intimacy work and all of that, was like, it's as a man in relation to a woman, she was saying, it's great to have the emotion and to show the emotion and to allow yourself that space. And actually, there were some, like breakups and people passing away where I gave myself the space to grieve, where in the past I wouldn't have. So I was really present with my emotions. But she was like, with a partner, uh, it's important to be able to be like, no, I'm having these emotions and I got this. Like, I'm not going to put this all on you. I
Right.
don't need you to fix me. I'm not going to like collapse into you.
Hmm.
And, I'm here having this experience and it's okay.
Yeah.
And so that's been actually really eye-opening and fulfilling. It's allowed me to hold space better for other people also.
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, thank you for sharing that. And
Yeah.
I'm so glad that you are on the other side of that really dark
Yeah.
place. Um, yeah, I think the gift in this work is hard, I will say that,
Yeah.
right? But the gift in it is that I think you learn to trust yourself more. You learn to have the boundaries that you need to really be relational, and that allows us to get so much more support. I find that when folks are struggling sometimes to fully know who they are, they often will rely too much on the definition of someone else's validation or
Mhm.
support. And that's one of the dangers that we run into when we're talking about the male loneliness epidemic and how men can really come out of that. Because again, so many men are looking for their partnership to sort of do the emotional functioning for them, and that creates a dependence that they don't necessarily like and doesn't feel good.
Yeah.
It often feels very disempowering for men to sort of outsource all of their emotional regulation to their partner, but they haven't yet learned how to do it for themselves. And it creates a lot of resentment in both directions in heterosexual dynamics. Um, so I think it's really important to like find that therapist if you have the access to them that can help you and can sort of step by step help you start building those skills.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. So before we get into this last part, where can people reach you, find you, follow you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
probably my website would be the best place to start, modernintimacy.com. And on Instagram and TikTok, I'm at Dr. Kate Balestrieri, and on YouTube, I'm at Modern Intimacy.
Awesome. Okay. And then so just this last part, because my goal with this podcast has really been to, share with folks and get a clear picture of like what liberation can look like for society, for humanity,
Mhm.
uh, sex and intimacy and relationships. Like for me, uh, being able to be present in relationships, whether it's personal or with myself or with my
Mhm.
kids or with a partner and out in the world has been like that's what's really been most inspiring for me is like is that connection. So I'm curious for you, what does liberation look like? What does that mean? How can we get there?
Oh, such a good question, such a big question.
Yeah.
Um, I think there's so many ways to answer that, but maybe one of the places that I'll start is that liberation to me often means feeling safe and connected in your own body and around your immediate community. So, liberation to me means being able to live in the world in your skin just as you are, without fear that you're going to be hurt because of who you are or how you look or what your beliefs might be. Liberation means respect for mutuality. It means understanding that everyone has different limits and really being intentional to mind those limits and not transgress people's boundaries. So liberation is as much about freedom as it is about responsibility, right? So if we want people to respect what we need and respect our trajectory in the world, we also need to do that for other folks and be really mindful of the fact that we are all we're all on this earth for just a period of time. We're all renting our space and time here. It's not permanent. Um, so, to the best of our ability, can we create a space where each of us gets to live a life that is resonant, that is connected, and is meaningful?
Awesome. I love it. Dr. Kate Balestrieri, thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure.
No, thank you. Thank you. This is such a great conversation. I really appreciate the invitation to be on your show.
Big thank you to Dr. Kate, and thank you to all of you for watching and listening. Please go to her website, modernintimacy.com. As I mentioned, I've referred people to her. I think she's awesome. And I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to talk and you all had the opportunity to watch and listen in. So modernintimacy.com will put all of her contacts in the show notes. Please go and watch Reimagining Safety. ReimaginingSafetyMovie.com is the website. And thank you for listening to Conversations for the People. Go ahead and like, share, and subscribe and do all the things that help the podcast keep going. So until next time, all power to the people.